Check 1, 2. Check 1 2 1 2. Check 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 check. Check 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2.
You just tested. What number is that?
Check 1 2 1 2.
Yeah. Okay.
Number one.
Number one was before number two. I don't know.
So this is live.
Yeah, you can,
Testing, testing.
if you want to control the switch, it's right here in the bottom. Just slide it.
And now, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the opening of the trade show. If you're here, you're a very special guest, capable of traversing the most difficult of Michigan climates to come together to share conversation, lectures, opinions, spark new partnerships, and I'm incredibly grateful to see you here despite the challenging weather outside. My name is Anya Sirota. I'm Associate Dean of Academic Initiatives here at Taubman College, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to this inaugural event, the trade show, something being hosted by TV Lab, a project that was launched at Taubman College this year, a new visualization shared facility that helps our faculty, students work on new technological modes of visualization in an experimental format. Today's event is features a number of lectures, workshops, installations, forums, and demonstrations that will be taking place in the Commons, in the TV Lab, and in CMYK, our studio space. So we invite you to visit the schedule, to pick up one of the catalogs, and to meander and wander around and encounter our faculty and guests in order to spark these conversations about emerging technologies and their spatial contexts. We're witnessing a rise in the power, affordability, and user-friendliness of visualization technologies, and we're seeing a lot of increased investment across diverse industries, including education, healthcare, which we'll address this morning, transportation, entertainment, and it suggests that extended reality has compelling current and future applications. It's becoming more firmly embedded in the way that we produce artifacts, have new modalities of communication, and envision the world. That said, the potential of XR in the domains of architecture, design, and planning is still unfolding. And to comprehensively explore these possibilities, Trade Show unites academia with the professions to showcase current XR design and visualization practices, and again, to spark critical dialogue about their potentials and conundrums and future applications. So what distinguishes a trade show from a symposium? A trade show is an exhibition that's designed for entities, individuals, in particular industries to showcase and demonstrate their latest products and services, to meet with industry partners, to observe the activities of their competitors, and to explore ways that the market and other opportunities can unite us. It's open to the public, it's supposed to be unpretentious, it's easy to access, and it's welcoming to all. So the trade show intentionally signals an attitude of accessibility, of equity, and welcome. It's available. If emerging visualization technology remains exclusive, accessible only to experts, and unwilling to unpack its methods and limitations, it will continue to exacerbate the social, class, and gender divisions that have consistently challenged our civic life. So appropriately, the essence of the trade show is a kind of show and tell. It's about serendipity, conviviality, unexpected discovery, and catalyzing new interests. I'm confident that the programs showcased today will bring us together in novel and exploratory ways. The attendees gathered here from across campus, the region, and the globe are challenging conventional expectations, engaging with technology in a socially centered manner, and exploring uncharted territories in visualization technology that can serve as a tool for fostering empathy, self-expression, and despite its perceived predispositions, humanity. So Trade Show owes its existence to the collaborative efforts of numerous individuals, my colleagues, the students here, institutional partners, newly formed alliances, and of course, our extremely hardworking staff. I want to express my sincere gratitude to the team, Jacob Kamersi, Project Manager for Academic Initiatives, and Ishan Pal Singh, TV Lab Manager, for their enthusiasm, indefatigable attitude, and dedication. I'm grateful and humbled to work with them. I also want to extend my heartfelt thanks for the participants who have journeyed far and near. Even getting from Central Campus to North Campus today has been a challenge. And they bring their expertise, their criticality, their perspectives for us to join, understand, and consider. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce and welcome the first conversation of the day, Visualizing Health, Immersive and Intelligent Imagery in Medicine and Architecture. The speakers are Michelle Ebersold, Robert Adams, Don Gilpin, Andrew Ibrahim, who's not here, but maybe will show up. Could be magic. Joy Nullblock, Jonathan Rule, and the moderator, Upali Nanda. Thank you.
I don't think we need to do anything else. Like, we're done. We're good. We're good with that as an opening. But I'll latch on to what you said in the middle about challenging conventions. No industry needs challenging conventions more than healthcare today. And no field is more ripe for innovation. And no field struggles more with the issue of visualization and simulation more than health. So extremely, extremely honored and privileged to serve as moderator today. We have with us Joy Nullblock, Dr. Joy Nullblock. She is the author of The Architecture of Good Behavior. She focuses on design and the human sciences and is the most futuristic historian I've ever met, which feels like a contradiction, but somehow is not. Dr. Michelle Ebersold is, we're meeting for the very first time. I've never heard this term before, a certified healthcare simulation educator. We are so lucky to have you, and a fellow in the American Academy of Nursing who works very, very closely with Jonathan Rule, who is mind child, this was pretty much. It really was, this panel was conceived by Jonathan, so we're all grateful that he got us here. He's an assistant professor of practice at the university here. His areas are design, construction, and digital technologies, but you'll see in the work that Michelle and Jonathan share how they're pushing the boundaries. Robert Adams is a good friend, associate professor at Taubman. He's also the chair of UM's Initiative on Disability Studies. Robert's approach to health is perhaps one of the most authentic and extremely critical that we've seen. So you'll hear from him. And with him, you'll have Don Gilpin, who's a lecturer here, and teaches drawing, design, and representation. But what she's doing right now with Lidar, to my mind at least, is exposing things that we had never seen clearly before. So incredible panel, and I get to moderate. And what earns me the privilege of moderating is applesauce. Let me tell you why. My role is as a pracademic. Most of my life is spent in practice. I'm the global research director for a large architectural firm called HKS. We do a lot of complex healthcare projects. Around 10 years ago, we were doing a very complex inpatient tower. We were trying to figure out what inpatient units should look like. We did a lot of field research. We did a lot of understanding how nurses move. And we realized that for a single pill, when a patient asks for a single pill, sometimes a nurse might walk as much as 1 mile. What was really interesting for us to observe was that a patient feels sick, the nurse goes and says, how can I help you? They say, I think I need medicine. They go to medication, get the medication. They come back, the patient has it, throws up. They go to a different room, get the stuff to clean them up, come back, clean up the patient. Patient says, I need water. They go to a different room, come back. And what was amazing is patient says, okay, now I'm ready for the medication, eats it, and they walked 0.8 miles across the unit to get applesauce. And this became famous as the applesauce moment for us because these amazing nurses and providers had never noticed how much they were walking. And none of the designs we had done were simulating the actual human script of how much the walking was and why. And the applesauce moment was when we could convince them we really need to do parametric analysis and we need to do simulations of all your plans instead of drawing them in 2 dimensions, because 2-dimensional drawings do not represent the 3 dimensions of operations and experience. And so applesauce is why I get to open this and hand it over to Joy.
I don't know what to do with this, but
The green button goes
I have
forward.
power.
Here you go.
I feel the power. So I'm glad to be here. Thanks for organizing all of this. I absolutely love the animals. with their bespoke VR headsets. Absolutely fantastic. I think my contribution here is rather different. As a historian and theorist, I will largely be a discursive and enthusiastic participant in the panel. But I have 2 minutes, I think, to tell you about 2 images. So this image is from an essay that I wrote, where I'm starting to look at longer-term meanings of words that relate to hospital environments. So this was a tile advertisement. As you can see, it talks about aseptic aesthetics and durability as requirements, desirable things that people who are designing hospitals might wish to have in 1916. And then we'll just skip forward to 2023. This was a mid-journey image that I made using those prompts and some more contemporary equivalents. It's interesting, it offered tile as a material. I didn't put that in as a prompt. But I'm really interested in using these data sets as an archive and thinking about what can we determine about aesthetic preferences by kind of querying them with various prompts, perhaps things that we know patients want in their hospital environment. And so that's the probably most direct reason I'm here, other than my overall enthusiasm and skepticism. So 2 minutes?
Less than. Now you get more time, Michelle.
Oh, hey, I can take more time. Well, first let me say I validate the applesauce story, having made those multiple trips in multiple places to deliver patient care. So I certainly appreciate all the work in that area. So I'm going to talk about a little different project that I've been working on. So this sort of visual, this is a XR app that I developed with Jeremy Nelson's team. And it's called Under the Skin. So let me tell you a little bit about what you're seeing here. So one of the things that I had a fortunate opportunity to do is work with Dr. Chris Fries on this multidisciplinary training looking at safety in delivering hazardous drugs to patients. And particularly patients who have cancer and are getting these chemotherapy drugs, which are really poison. If you look at the history of chemotherapy, mustard gas was where some of this originated from. So it's a very hazardous drug to handle for the nurses and to deliver to our patients. And so when we were teaching the course and helping people understand what happens inside the human body if one of these hazardous drugs sort of escapes the vein that it's being delivered in. And I looked around and could find no images of what that might look like inside the body. And unfortunately, we don't see the effect of that. We don't know it escaped the vein, and we don't see what happens to the skin outside until significant damage is done. So I wanted to help people understand why it's so critical to really observe your patient, and anytime they say something doesn't feel right or whatever, you really need to investigate it quickly. So I went back to my days with my kids and the magic school bus. And I came to Jeremy and I said, all right, I have this really great idea and it's based on the magic school bus. And I thought they'd laugh at me and say, yeah, right, whatever. I said, I want to be able to have this VR app where the nurses can go in and take care of a patient, or a pharmacist can go in, and then if the drug escapes the vein, I want them to see what it looks like inside. So it's like I want them to shrink down and go on a field trip with Mrs. Frizzle and go inside the vein and inside the cells and see how the hazardous drug can disrupt the DNA and spread and create all of this. So we created this really cool, I think cool, of course I'm a little biased, VR app where they can go inside a little magnifying glass, go under the skin and see what happens. So we were able to publish it on the App Lab, and everybody who's seen it has been really impressed and really excited about that. So that's sort of my first foray into some VR visualization from that perspective. The other thing that I've done is use this whole idea of immersive 360 video to sort of help put the healthcare provider, whoever it is, a nurse, a physician, a social worker, sort of in the perspective of this scene that's unfolding around them so that they can see how the provider and the patient are interacting and when things don't look so good and when things look really good. and just be able to sort of be almost like a fly on the wall, although you're a fly in the center, and just sort of watch what happens around you. So I've teamed up with Michigan Creative and Bob Berg's team, and we've created these, I think, kind of cool 360 videos that are now freely available on YouTube that nurses and others can use to really sort of dive inside various patient care experiences. And I have to just give a shout out. That is my daughter, who is actually works here in the emergency department and who is a nurse also in the Navy. And so this was our VR videos on looking at caring for veterans. So that's kind of my work and my visuals. So we'll hand it off to my colleague, Jonathan.
Thank you. All right. So let's see. So I'm probably the least qualified person to be on the healthcare panel. I have nothing to do with healthcare. Well, a little bit with Michelle. The initial work with Michelle, I think, has started sort of that trajectory. So I'm going to sort of describe where this came from and I think where it's going. So a couple years ago, again, working with Jeremy Nelson and the team from the Center for Academic Innovation, similar to how Michelle did with Under the Skin, we pitched a project called Augmented Tectonics. So Augmented Tectonics doesn't look at healthcare at all. It's more for construction and construction courses and construction pedagogy here at Taubman College. And so what we intended to do, let's see if this plays. It's not going to want to play. Oh well.
Can I push a button for you?
Let's see if we can push a button. Technology. And then it's just going to cycle and it probably won't play, but that's okay. So Augmented Tectonics had two things that we were trying to achieve. One was students that are coming into architecture, especially at the beginning, there's sort of a lag between understanding the 2D versus the 3D and transitioning back and forth, and especially when we get into construction where systems and layers are quite complex. And so how do you begin to unpack that when you look at like a two-dimensional abstract drawing? Really understanding those layers is something that's foreign. It's almost like learning a new language. And so the hope was that through this, which you're not seeing here, unfortunately, I'm just going to go back to this previous slide if it lets me. Now it's not going to let us advance or anything. So what the hope was is that this would short circuit that relationship between understanding a two-dimensional representation and a three-dimensional object. So it's an immersive experience where students are able to, almost a museum experience where students are able to go into their textbook, or it's kind of taking their textbook and turning it into something three-dimensional, where they're able to interact with these components and see the relationship between the two-dimensional drawing and the three-dimensional object. The second sort of objective of it was to remove kind of traditional means of metrics, so as opposed to like paper-based exams and tests, or online forms that students would have to fill out. We wanted to make it an immersive experience where students could, there we go, okay, at least we got back to that one, where students could take their exams or their tests through this immersive experience. And so a lot of it is trying to develop a certain level of interactivity where there's an embodied connection between the student and the object as a way to create a different type of a learning platform for this experience. So it's less about rote memorization of concepts, but really trying to understand things through interactivity. Let me see if it'll let me skip to the next one. Oh, look, now it goes. Hey, that's great.
Good.
Well, I should probably skip through because I'm going to be definitely over my
No, this
3
is
minutes.
good. Let's watch
You're
it.
fine.
Let's let it watch, okay. So this is what you were supposed to be seeing before. And I guess audio did come on, even though I thought I turned audio off. But this will give you an idea of what the experience is like. So we go through these different modules. The lecture series is divided up into different materials, wood, concrete, masonry, glass, and metals. And so this takes students through these different material modules and gives them sort of a broad overview and understanding of it. Again, bringing things into a more three-dimensional learning experience. So not trying to simulate a construction site necessarily, but trying to give them bits and pieces of what they might encounter if they were to find this in a construction site. Also all the processes, how materials are produced and made, trying to also understand certain environmental components of where your materials come from. So say high embodied energy of concrete construction versus maybe low carbon footprints of wood construction. So again, it takes the students through all these things. We'll just let it finish.
So while this is playing, I'll true confession here. When Jonathan mentioned augmented tectonics, like I had no idea what that was. I thought that was, like some sort. It's
Cool,
this.
a
It's
cool
cool. It's like it's just how much we learn from each other. I'm like augmented tectonics. What is that?
So yeah, we moved once. So one of the things that I guess we didn't mention, Michelle and I are also faculty XR innovators and residents at the university. So we work closely with Jeremy and the Center for Academic Innovation, sort of as an advisee role on setting things up like events like this, not necessarily, but we do have the XR Summit coming up in April. So I guess we'll plug that here today.
Absolutely.
And I'm just gonna skip forward to the next one just to kind of quickly if it lets me. Come on. There we go. Okay, so just to quickly introduce where kind of healthcare comes in. So speaking with Michelle in sort of our conversation about how we might be able to advance some of this technology in the classroom, we put together a grant proposal through the Arts Plus curriculum grant funding cycle, which allowed us to join our two seminars, hers through the School of Nursing and mine through the School of Architecture, to begin to look at the redesign of healthcare spaces, and specifically three rooms within the medical system. So what we've been doing is really trying to understand these technologies and what affordances they have. Great. I'm going to give this to you.
Lucky you.
No updates.
Just so we know where the real power lies, that it's not with the humans.
Okay. What affordances these technologies have in redesigning or reconceiving medical spaces, and less from the perspective of the patient. So there's, I think, a lot of work that's being done to look at the patient, but as even Upali has mentioned, the applesauce story, there's a lack of study or analysis of what the caretaker is going through and how do we begin to design for that. So the seminar, which is currently in process, or the two seminars which is currently in process, are pairing nursing students and architecture students together through virtual environments to develop new strategies for how we might reconceive these three medical spaces. And so, yeah, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Sorry for all the technical difficulties, but I'll pass it off to you.
No, I'm glad that worked out. Good morning, everybody. I'm Robert Adams. This is Dawn Gilpin. And you know, you never walk into a hospital and say, wow, this is a really great plan. Like the drawing of the hospital is something that you never see in a way that is about making sense of where you're at. And especially true when you're a patient. It may be a patient under some duress, like the space of the hospital, all of a sudden, instantly, as soon as you go through the double doors, it winds up all sorts of anxieties. It's disorienting. Where you're supposed to go is totally disaggregated, and it results in buildings that look like exactly like this. This is the Cardiovascular Center here at the University of Michigan. If you haven't seen the hospital, it's like a city within the city, a sort of medical city within the city. It sits up on top of a hill. It presides over this part of Ann Arbor. Right next to it is the city's largest cemetery. So it's a really interesting relationship, in the city itself. So one thing that we've been doing over the last few years is thinking about the question of complexity, and especially when considering complex global challenges. And you could run those in your head and think about what those might be for you. One of the things that's, I think, essential to our work is how do you engage complex real-world conditions with equally complex methodologies in order to understand the spatial stories? How do you communicate those stories so that that information can be handed off to other people in ways that are compelling, useful, inspirational, and informative. So in our work, we've been using Lidar 3D scanning instruments and also Unreal Engine, which is a gaming platform, to scan a whole range of different types of sites, including sites here at the university. So this is the cardiovascular scan of an operating theater. This is the still image scan of the operating theater. We got connected to this space through Dr. Andrew Ibrahim, who's sitting right next to Apolli down there.
It's very, very accomplished.
And so you can see in this space a kind of composite imaging of all the, you wouldn't say the room itself is the architecture, but the apparatus of everything in the room becomes the architecture of this space. And so we'll take you through one of these scans that we're producing, and maybe Dawn can talk a little bit about this.
Sure. So over the past 2 years, I've been fortunate enough to work with a FEAST group, faculty and engineering arts student teams. And team size ranges from 17 to 6 students who are in sub-teams of data visualization, data curation, scanning, and we're writing workflows and developing methodologies for using the Lidar scans to collecting the data, registering the scans, curating the data in Unreal and many other softwares and apps. And I think what I find is common in the introductions is getting access, visual access, to whether it's your imagination or whether it's the inside of the vein or the interior of a section of a building, or spaces like this that have high levels of stress or really unknown in terms of the patient's experience. This is the first time that we have scanned a space like this. Light and reflective surfaces don't work well, so you see a lot of ghosting and noise in the space, which I think is somewhat interesting given kind of the antiseptic, kind of sterile environment that we're familiar with. So Lidar has, I think in terms of health care, that data set is so incredibly powerful. It can tell a story, it can show you the actual section of a building, it can document the process of construction along with the 360 imaging so that when the wall is actually closed, you can open it up and you understand kind of the mechanisms within that section. But for us, these, I think we've been developing 7 or 8, it might be up to 9 protocols for scanning different sites to enable access for others, but primarily for those who own those sites and supporting them in telling their stories and supporting them and doing their work in terms of moving conventional kind of staid practices into more exciting ways of thinking about designing spaces with technology. So we're super excited about this. We're just 2 years into it, but we have to acknowledge kind of the students that have been involved in this, supporting and driving the work.
It's amazing. I want to do a quick round of applause for our Catalyst presentations. And I have to say, after seeing it all, I think my original batch of questions is just going to go off. Like, never mind, we're going to ask new things. But before we get into the panel discussion, are there any burning questions from the audience here? They're going to start burning very quickly. I loved how we closed this. The fact that in our world, representation is always in terms of plans and renderings, and those two are the most inaccessible visually to the real person who's going to either live in those environments or experience or operate in them. So maybe we start with all the different types of visualization we've talked about. And Michelle, you talked about visualizing both the science, because you don't understand what's happening, and understanding the science behind it helps you understand what's happening to you. And you talked about visualizing the experience. So maybe you and Jonathan can talk a little bit about where you're going and what's the delta from where we are at. Like, why is it so important to get there?
You want me to start?
Sure.
So, So one of the things that I've always been very passionate about is, not only my work in using simulation, extended reality, but I've also, having been a former director in the healthcare area, as well as a nurse practicing, understanding the nursing workload and understanding things from the nursing perspective. I was just talking to my leadership class yesterday, and I was saying, if you were in a factory, nobody would tell you to go off the factory line to go get, another box of screws or another tool you need. That would be brought to you, or it would be there. And, I think as we probably said, it's like in healthcare, those nurses are running all over the place. The other thing is the room setup sometimes are really focused around patient satisfaction, patient safety to some extent, but not always sort of the promoting a good way for the caregivers to really provide that care. So when Jonathan came to me with this arts initiative, one of the first things that sort of popped into my mind was, knowing his work and understanding a little bit about architecture, I'm like, what if we looked at some room redesign? So, and not from a patient perspective, not that patients aren't important, they are absolutely important, but I think as we said, we've done a lot of work in this area. Let's look at it from the nursing perspective. Let's look at how we could create something that would just make it easier for the nurses to deliver care, because we know that that's going to create more positive patient outcomes and patient satisfaction. So that's kind of where we started, and then we had to figure out how to make our classes sort of dovetail together. So
Yeah, and I think that's that's where we're still working on that part, but that's why we have this grant. I think for me, as far as visualizing the science of it, like Upalia is saying, so when you gave the applesauce story, I think that's one way of looking at it, where it's very much about a data set where it's a numerical value of time, right? But sometimes that doesn't translate to time and space. We have an understanding of the time and space relationship. And so for me, and especially through this project with Michelle, it's how do we begin to kind of assess time, space, and maybe other things that can be gleaned through immersive mapping, right? So it's I think a new level of interaction with these spaces, a new level of understanding these spaces that might not have been kind of understood through two-dimensional diagramming or the recording of simple timestamps between spaces, right? And so that's, I think, what's interesting to me is how do we begin to take advantage of some of these technologies. I think even like what you guys are doing as far as looking at it through as a spatial construct, and not so much as how we've traditionally looked at things through plan and section, which are somewhat difficult to understand. So I think that for me was like the natural transition between augmented tectonics as the pedagogical application for architecture students to how do you begin to translate this into other areas of the discipline that might include healthcare or beyond as well.
And I think one of the side benefits to that too is the fact that as we did a little virtual field trip last week where the nursing students were able to kind of come in and see what's being done, is now all of a sudden you have two groups of individuals who are going to be in their future work roles perhaps interfacing and working together, and now there's just a deeper level of understanding what those capabilities are.
And there's something that both of you touched on, which Robert and Dawn talked about, is this idea of shared visualization and the power in that. That we really actually don't have equity in visualization. Architects and designers see one thing, they visualize in a certain way, the patients and the workers see it in a completely different way. And so maybe, Robert, let's take that idea forward with what is LiDAR allowing us to do? You kind of touched on it. And what are some of the challenges with how we traditionally visualize and simulate, and how we are breaking new ground with what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you just zoom out a little bit and look at visual culture, broadly speaking, you have like electronic vehicle, autonomous vehicle industry emerging, which is now producing data sets of mostly urban spaces and transportation corridors. And so LiDAR is being used mostly for machine vision. And the opticality of that is low resolution, trying to detect the threat of the environment in order to mitigate risk for vehicles and so on, and other objects. And at the other extreme, you have MRI imaging in the hospital, which is a much more familiar, like if we say MRI imaging, most everyone can conjure up what that might look like. And so I think it's a really interesting moment where imaging systems are being drawn closer and closer together, and we're really interested in this convergence between environmental imaging, human imaging, both the interior of the body, and just finding ways to develop a correspondence between those things and find different types of cultural resonance. So, you know, health outcomes are one question that you can work on, but you can also work on these things from a kind of critical disability aesthetics perspective that tells a kind of narrative arc about what the cultures we want to participate in and then what the process of making, unmaking, and remaking might have to do with those cultures. So Lidar is interesting, just like an MRI is interesting, in that it kind of unmakes this idea of the body or of the building or of the space as a singular homogeneous thing and begins to break it down through sections. You can study it in different ways, and I think just reveals a whole range of things, both for the scientific biomedical project, but also for intellectual creative project.
I think that the concept of unmaking is really, really important. And I know, Joy, often in the conversations, when you're looking at this field of representation and how it's been exploding in many ways, there's also a cautionary tale there, right? So talk a little bit about what are we not thinking about that we need to have on our radar?
Well, I think the reason that healthcare is such an interesting place to put this in is it's really hard to deny things like fear and you know, just the threat of some of these technologies. I think, you know, the threat of some of these really non-human environments. You know, the hospital's not really that optimized to be a lovely place to work in or arrive for care. So I think particularly taking this on in a healthcare lens, it's really just hard to deny things like that. And questions of disability, different ways of accessing space, neurodiversity, different ways of perceiving space. And I think, you know, the point clouds are really potentially, those visualizations are potentially really, you know, in their current state, which I you know, the post-digital, I love the artifacts, that kind of, from that perspective, but that's our sort of elite design. Like, I love the horror of what's happened to some of the people. It seems like those white outlines are people that walked by, so like that's a fun dehumanization in the representation, but being able to see the gap between that, and if you showed this to somebody and said, oh, don't worry, my child, this is where you're gonna have your surgery, they'd probably be like, what? So I think in healthcare, it's just, I like it because it's really hard not to be critical, because, you know, not only are there privacy protections that may not exist in other fields, but there are, you know, real things at stake about, you know, not to be too grand, but life and death, right? And real threats of annihilation and things like that. So I don't know if that's quite how you wanted me to answer that question, but it's where I've been.
It's better than the way I wanted you to answer the question, so you're good. But while we have you, which we do, but what you were doing with the mid-journey images too is, I think there's a very interesting translation between the words we use and the visualizations that occur because of that. Like what's sparking that? What's going into a visualization? And if you're not using the right words, if you're not giving the right prompts, what are some of the risks there? Who's visualizing for whom? Who's not in the room? Who's in the room? Like the moment an image becomes compelling, it becomes the truth. And it becomes shared widely, and that's, once it's compelling, once it's realized in a visual form, that's what you anchor around. So what do we need to be really cautious about as we start visualizing and simulating?
Yeah, I think that, you know, we've had this conversation amongst us, but I think in kind of giving this tool to patients, we'll see what we need to, I don't know, but we'll be able to ask them. So I think the other thing that's really neat about tools like Midjourney is the barrier to entry, right? The low skill, someone who can't necessarily visualize another means can be given these tools and, oh, you tell me what you like. Okay, here's 25. It took us 5 seconds to make them. Do you like a little bit more this way? Do you like, you know, I think, again, not quite answering the question the way that you want, but I think that the tool can be given to all these populations and enable them, empower them to, you know, really show us what they want.
And if we were ever assuming it right, and if they're putting the same inputs into the tool that we would.
Yeah, so yeah, they can put completely different ones.
Yeah, well, I can keep going with questions, so I'm going to stop again, pause, and say, do we have a burning question now? It's okay if it's just sizzling. Thank you. I should have started with sizzling. Right. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yep.
Thanks. I was really interested in kind of the opportunity of customization within the within the hospital environment, because I was kind of in the operation theater when my son was being born, and the doctor was delivering him had a very specific place where he wanted things. Right, so is that something that would be enabled by these kind of visualizations where a room could be pre-prepped fairly accurately and then sort of systems translated?
I mean, that was when we were in the operating theater. There's a back wall where all the surgeons that use that space have all their tools. And the tools themselves were all customized. Like, they're all doing the same procedure or similar types of procedures, but everyone has like their specific tools, and there's a kind of provenance around those artifacts.
Yep.
That's definitely, it's not so dissimilar from going to like a, auto mechanics garage, and the mechanic has, their specific tools that they use as well. So the customization part, I think, another interesting story that we learned in the space of the hospital is the Patricia Silverman, who's one of the lead people in the OR space, lead administrators, said one day they were operating, all theaters are full of people, patients being operated on, and there was a fire in one of the operating rooms. It's like a bad joke, right? and so they had to stop the procedure, evacuate everybody, but the problem was nobody knew where to go because the scenario had never been played out, and moreover, people working in that space, you're not going to all different buildings in the hospital, of which there's like 40 different buildings up there. And so people didn't know how to move from one space to the next. And so they were thinking like one utilization of the LiDAR is, could you start training people with evacuation protocols or just like wayfinding protocols for people that actually work there?
Yep.
And on the other side, we were thinking about, in terms of customizing the patient experience, could you use LiDAR to preview spaces like this that are always back of house? You never see that. You're in the lobby, waiting room, exam room, but you never see the OR room. And we were just thinking about like that kind of utility.
Makes a lot of sense.
Maybe speaking to customization as well, and we think a lot about speculative fiction and creative productions. But for any change, especially in an institution that is so rigid, to be able to show what they might perceive as science fiction, to be able to show change or some type of customization process within the institution of the hospital, to show that in a format such as this, makes it, to Pauli's point, the image is real. It's believable. And so it's not a set of plans, it's not a verbally described design ideas that might play out. You're actually moving through the space that could be ideal, of course with a description and diagrams probably of the systems that might have to change for that. But these are moments where one can kind of be in that space and understand what the experience might be and soften that threshold between kind of the existing condition and what customization might do for an institution.
Yeah. And I'm sorry our invisible surgeon is not here, so Andrew would have spoken to this as well, but for surgeries, that's exactly what they do. Every surgery has a different kind of setup and they have to do it. Scenario testing is one of the key reasons simulation is used in practice. You test out different scenarios, that's what you're trying to do. What's interesting in what we're hearing is instead of just scenario testing, you can now start scenario building. And you can start visualizing scenarios that you hadn't thought about, because we test based on our current perception and our current spaces right now. But I think customization would absolutely be one of the biggest proof cases, because it's not possible to do infinite customization once you've built it out or with a physical mock-up. So it's a very compelling use case.
So I think just to add a practical example, since we've talked about the cardiovascular center, so if, and I think everybody has a good understanding of if you come into the emergency department with chest pain and you have a certain type of heart attack that is like in process, you have a finite amount of time to get that patient from the emergency room to the cath lab and the cardiovascular center. And in our institution, the emergency center is in the main hospital and the cath labs are in the cardiovascular center. They are connected, but they are connected by hallways and bridges. And so to be able to transport that patient from the emergency department to the cath lab within so many minutes, I know that they did some sort of physical testing of that. However, wouldn't it have been cool if we had this type of visualization to be able to test that out ahead of time?
Yep.
Instead of after the building, was built, and then it was, how far do we need to go, and what kinds of equipment do we need at like the halfway point should our patient need something. So it's just just kind of brings it to home when you realize that. And when you talk about, certified healthcare educator and that in simulation, so mostly it's simulation and training, but it's just really using that whole idea of simulation to simulate not only patient care, but things like this, fire drills and all of that, which in the past, it's been very static. You read a piece of paper that says if there's a fire in the OR, this is what you do, but in reality, it's not how it feels.
Right, and I think a lot of these things in the field of architecture, we try to glean from post-occupancy studies, which is something that is extremely costly and seldomly gets done. So thinking about like these technologies as a way to maybe transition it from post-occupancy to pre-occupancy, how do you really kind of play out these scenarios and use these tools to be able to do that? And again, through the visualization simulation, it begins to open up new opportunities for how we might begin to rethink how we work as designers and architects with the health field and other fields as well.
Absolutely. Other questions from the audience? Yes.
Is this working now? No.
No.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah. This work is absolutely fascinating, and I can begin just now to imagine the prototyping of the human condition in these institutional spaces in novel and unprecedented ways. Some of the projects you showed come from a non-human subjectivity. The toxic chemicals spilling into our veins, the section of the building where we're traveling up and down the aspects of its aggregate systems in ways that we could never occupy unless we were cockroaches, other dehumanized, phantasmagorical aspects of the human figure that appear in your work. I'm just wondering how those visualization techniques either change our perspectives, add to our capacity to experience empathy, problematize what it is to be human, and how you've been thinking about that kind of work that disembodies us in order to re-embody us in some sort of a new perspectival way.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that some of the power of some of these immersive technologies, even through our avatars. So when our nursing students last week were able to log into the Archeo platform, even from their computer, their avatars then sort of came into the space, and then they were able to interact with the students in Jonathan's class as well, and look around the space. And there was some really great dialogue. So it was almost like there's that sort of sense of presence. There's, it's like I feel like I'm in this environment. They're sort of looking around, and they were able to see things like this pass-through cabinet and talk about that. So how they bring that back into the real world, I don't know yet. But I'm anxious to talk to them a little bit about their sort of avatar experience and what that was like for them to be sort of immersed in this environment.
So with the point clouds, you could take point clouds and you could convert them to mesh files, and they can look real, kind of. They can look more finished, more exact. And I'm really interested in working with point clouds, even though the data is absolutely massive, to try to figure out how to minimize those files so that when one reads a point cloud or is in the space of a point cloud, you stay with it a little bit longer because it's just not quite right. And so it's figuring out kind of what point of view is this, what's the story behind this. It sets up a whole set of questions to me that the more familiar it is, the more we think we know, and the less time you spend with the space. And in our situation, in terms of, for our team, listening to the story so that you can have that moment of attention to begin that process of empathy, I think is most important. And empathy to then engage in the conversation. And that's most important for us, that there's awareness and therefore some contribution of a position or thoughts on the situation that we're presenting through these point clouds.
And there was a very interesting prompt in that question, which is empathy for the things that were previously unseen. So empathy for the science, for the way the body actually works. I could never see it before. My senses were not equipped to see how the mechanisms work, and now I can. So does that create a different type of empathy than just what I would see? So I think this dissection that happens, this ability to expose things that were not exposed in the past and then create like a new version of empathy is a very powerful prompt. So I really appreciate the question. Joy, Robert, Jonathan, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think going back to just Anya's comment about like being the cockroach going up the section, and sort of like but I think less of the cockroach, but more of like, again, going back to the embodied experience, right? I think architecture for maybe the past couple decades has has lost the embodied relationship a little bit, especially with the mediums that we work through. When we were all drafting still, there was a relationship between the scale of the drawing and the body, and so that was brought into it. As soon as we got into some of these newer softwares, there was a distance, I think, between the scale of the body and the artifact that was being produced. And now this has also kind of brought us back into a relationship between the architecture and the body as we're kind of working through it and designing it. I think through both the LiDAR scans, as soon as you can kind of get into that space, you can see it on the screen and visualize it, but you could also put yourself into that space and see it in a different way. Or like working with the nursing students, it's less about presenting them an image that's static, but it's something like move around. They can see it from different vantage points and viewpoints. And so I think there's information that now is starting to come to light through that that was maybe removed from architecture for a little while, and so we're getting it back.
I mean, there's a lot of, you know, and just to touch on the question just a little bit, in a lot of higher education, there's always chatter around, you know, transdisciplinary work, cross-disciplinary work, and so on. And I think,
all right.
There we go.
Sorry about that. One thing that I've been so impressed with Dawn's feast team is that there's 6 different disciplines in that space, 6 different disciplines, different students in on the game of visualization, and everyone has a role to play in that. And so it's been so cool to see like students of architecture, College of Engineering, art students, dance students, all collaborating on this larger project that, in a sense, any one discipline could not accomplish. So there's a high level, I think, of synthesis just in terms of new ways by which we work together that are integrative, just like integrative medicine is a kind of thing, or precision medicine. It takes all these different perspectives in order to fully understand what's at stake in this moment of 21st century.
Joy?
Well, and I think there's so much that can be done with it from a perspective of diverse visual processing, I think. One of the things I'm seeing as I'm watching the scanning representation is, you know, if the camera is moving but also panning, that can be challenging for certain kinds of visual processing. So we can also think about, you know, it seems like it really gets high resolution of what's directly in front of it. Some people may not process that way, and that may be hard, and the side may be more. So we could also think about it, you know, kind of giving other ways of vision. You know, you could show what it's like to occupy it in another way, and then of course thinking about, you know, other heights, that one could be shorter, one could be taller, whether in a wheelchair or being a child, or these kinds of things. I think there's all kinds of, you know, diversity of perception that could be brought into it. And I just, because I love the animals and their VR goggles, you know, also other kinds of animal perception. Some of us enjoy working with horses, and, you know, they perceive very differently. And I think, you know, it could be a cool kind of thing to think about non-human perceptual, not seeing in front of you at all, and what that environment was like, not to bring Temple Grandin into things, but thinking about animal fear, I think as well. So I don't know, I think there's so much that could be done with it.
Great. We have 5 minutes, so I think we have time for one more question. Any more questions from the audience? Yeah.
Hi.
That came from an unexpected place.
I see all those very complex model, and it's really interesting, really creativity. And I just wanted to ask, have ever this complex model have been input into the real life project? If yes, what kind of challenge are you guys facing through the develop of the model and like in between of the digital to the real life?
Michelle, I think we'll give that to you first in that translation to the real nursing world. Yeah.
So I will say that most of my work with buildings unfortunately didn't allow us to sort of leverage some of this technology, which is unfortunate. Probably the best that we were ever able to get was, really pictures, or sort of when we built our simulation center, we kind of toured other simulation centers just so we could get a visual and stuff. So I think though the power of this is now, as we've sort of looked at some of the healthcare spaces, like the patient care room, and now I can actually walk through it and see things, it's sort of opened up this whole other way of looking. It's like, oh, now I can really visualize this in a way that allows me to think about if I moved this here, or if we redid this, then what would that be like? So much more we can do than just looking at those architectural drawings on a piece of paper. So.
We've been working on a project for the Rackham Graduate School over the last couple of years, which is a prominent university building on our campus. And initially, Dawn and her team made a LiDAR scan of the exterior of the building and also the interior. And then we scanned the room where it's like a little meditation space. And so we had that digital asset in order to help us think about the design and, running scenarios through it. And then we built a physical model. And then that physical model was scanned, and then you could take the physical model that was now digitized and put that into a LiDAR scan through Unreal Engine, and all of a sudden, there's a seamless transition. It's not so much like what does the digital produce in terms of the real, it's more about the constant interplay between the real and the virtual, I think, is increasingly becoming collapsed, where the distinctions between the two are lessening, and that's quite interesting to me.
I think that the imagined and the real, the visualized and the real, that blurring of the boundaries is probably what this entire day is a little bit about. Like you're getting to that, it's a brand new field. I will perhaps close on a slightly depressing thought for you, that in the practice out there, the distance between the affordances we have in the technology and the implementation in real projects is huge. We are nowhere close to it. And in reality, we are nowhere close to it because we are a fundamentally wasteful industry. The industry by itself doesn't prototype. The industry by itself doesn't have this culture of saying, hey, if I fixed out this particular layout, maybe I start improving on it. So in some ways, the culture of representation that we have had in practice, where architects have been responsible for providing drawings and renderings and not visualizations that can be realized, is part of why we are not seeing it. So the potential is huge. The mapping between the innovation and the implementation towards outcomes and impact, I think that's what we need to start doing right now. And that does come from trade shows. That comes from having these forums where industry and academia can come together and collide, to use Robert's words, in transdisciplinary ways. You almost need to put disciplinary arrogance aside for any change to happen. So, extremely glad that you guys could join us and risk your lives to do so in the snow. Panel, thank you so much. We could talk forever, but the work is incredible and inspiring, and very glad that we could start the morning this way.